I'm going to tell you something about the city of Rotterdam, where you are. You have already seen something of it, but no one will have seen everything that I'll show you. And that's not everything that is about Rotterdam. I will do on 2 occasions something about Switzerland too, where Switzerland touches Rotterdam. Would have been 3. I wanted to start with the Thomasee near Cour, but I took it out. I thought that takes too long, and now talking like this, it takes even longer without it. But I'll show you something about the history, and especially how you can still see the history in this city. Because the problem with Rotterdam is it was bombed in 1940, and most of its history before 1940 just disappeared, it's gone. But some traces are still visible, and maybe you can do something with it. I'll do also something about art that is used to show history, and maybe you can do with that too, something with that too. I'll start in the Middle Ages. This is how people think Rotterdam started. Oh, I get another. It doesn't go. Archaeologists think that Rotterdam looked like when it started. This is the river that still exists. This is the river Rotte, and the name Rotterdam stems from the river Rotte. If you want to, it's about 2 hours on bike to go from Rotterdam to the source of the Rotte, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Here you can see they drew some farms. They think that it was, and to the right is what they think it looked like at that time. It was all destroyed in the 12th century by a flood. Oops. And some things can be seen. This is in the market hall. I guess you'll go there. In the market hall, in the center is a stairwell, and they made an exhibition of archaeological finds there. And the lower you get, the older the finds are. So down at the bottom are the finds, archaeological finds from the very early years of Rotterdam. You can just get in, doesn't cost anything, and it's in the parking garage basically. Then the river Rotte was dammed, in terms of there was a dam put in it, and to prevent it from flooding behind the dam. But to prevent flooding behind the dam because of rain, they had to put in some locks, to get the water out of it if there was too much water. This is what they think it looked like at about 1270. The place, this is where now is the market hall. And this is the place now. The first example of art. They made art this foot and this foot. It symbolizes the first steps across the river Rotte when Rotterdam was formed. I think personally it's a ridiculous piece of art. Because well, you know, with artists, many of you have some links with the artistry, so to say, in Swiss. And one thing that they teach you is get very good stories about something that doesn't mean anything. This is an example of that. But you'll see it. Here you'll see this. It's like what the river used to be, or where the river used to be. This was the river, but in 1945 the river was made into land. They put it full of stones from the bombardment, and they made this after some time. This is what it looked like in the 14th century, the archaeologists think. This is the dam that I just talked about, and there you see a canal. Without that canal, Rotterdam would have been nothing, because there was no hinterland for Rotterdam. But that canal gave a hinterland because it connected Rotterdam with Delft and the rest of the cities, rich cities in Holland, and made it possible for Rotterdam to develop into a port city. This is the canal. And this is what you still see of it now. So it's still there. It should be one of the most important parts of the center of Rotterdam, because without this, It would never have been the city it now is, but, well, it's not very appealing, I think. And this is not a factory, by the way, but this is for heat. Now, in those days, 15th century, we got a very famous philosopher that was born here. Maybe he lived here just a few years, but we don't have many important and famous people, so even those few years is counted as enough. Erasmus, that's the first connection to Switzerland, because he was born in Rotterdam, he died in Basel, and his grave is still to be found in Basel. And if you go to the Koolsingel, close to the City Hall, the other side there's this mural, and that symbolizes the trip of Erasmus in the center between Rotterdam and Basel. Then Rotterdam grew. This is in the 16th century. It got city walls, and here you see it's like a triangle, Rotterdam. Some call it a shoe, but let's call it a triangle. And it's still, the center of town is still called the city triangle, Stadsdriehoek in Dutch. What do you see of these walls? This. If you go to the railway station Blaak, it's very close to the Markthal, in some part this is hanging from the roof. And it's part of the old city wall. It's the only bit of city wall in Rotterdam that is still visible. And when this train tunnel was made, they found this bit of city wall and they decided to keep it and to find a way to show it to the people. So this is what they did. This is in its original position. So the trains really go much deeper than the foundation of the city wall was at that time. Then the Golden Age. Rotterdam grew. First, what was green became built up. And because of that, that was not enough. People of Rotterdam needed to grow further, so the city decided to use this too. And this was a city-made plan. New ports, houses for the rich merchants. This is more or less what the big canals in Amsterdam are for Amsterdam. This part of town was that for Rotterdam, the center of commerce. Nothing's left of that, except the waters. Let's see. And then Rotterdam grew on. The center of town within the walls was completely filled up. There was no more space. And people started to look for space outside the city walls, here and there. It's kind of informal enlargement of the city, because the city wasn't the boss there. They had nothing to say there. People just went there. They bought a bit of land and they started doing something. They were not allowed it in part because they were not allowed to build anything that would hinder the defense of the city, so that the enemy couldn't hide there. It should be open area. But it wasn't enforced for a long time, and it got fuller and fuller, as you see on the right hand. This is what it looked like in 1700, and you see the formal city, this, as planned by the city itself, and the informal city is really big on 2 or 3 sides of the city too. Everything happened there what wasn't allowed in the city itself. One of the first circuses in Rotterdam, or in the Netherlands, was located here. And the director of that circus, when he was 80 years old, he could still dance on a rope. And he did that on skates. And he did that with people hanging from his legs. At least that is the story. He was world famous in Rotterdam. Like everything that is world famous in Rotterdam is only world famous in Rotterdam. This is a detail of that map, and yesterday Jan Rothuizen told you about a map of Amsterdam and the detail it gives. This is what the same for Rotterdam. There's an enormous bit of detail on this map to show what is happening there. These white things, it's called bleaching meadows. That's where the laundry was bleached and dried in the sun. This, you see small boxes there. these boxes were full of manure, and then they put a vase in it. In the vase they put beer for the expensive things, or urine for the less expensive things. In it they put lead. Then it all got hot because of the manure. And after some time there was white on the lead, and that was the basis for paint, white paint. It was a dangerous trade, but the Rotterdam product was supposed to be one of the best in Europe. I wouldn't have wanted to work there, personally. Then here you see small, like towers, small houses. They are gardens for the people that lived in Rotterdam. They hated the stench and the noise of Rotterdam, and they had themselves a little garden on the edge of town. And you can see there's many of them. Here, 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 here. It's all informal. This is the bleachers, how they did the laundry. And this is something you will see in Rotterdam, something that's called the Lijnbaan. Now it's a shopping center. At that time, this was the Lijnbaan. And it's a very long building, open building, and they made ropes there, ropes for ships. Lijn is meant rope. So this survives in terms of the name is still there, the name Lijnbaan. Then in the 19th century, Rotterdam, well, there was something rotten in the state of Rotterdam at that time. The stench was enormous, and living conditions were very bad. We had several cholera epidemics here, and the cause of that was the bad condition of the water. The water was very unhealthy, and there was a city architect. They decided to make a water project, and for it he made new water courses there and there, like a new city wall in water. And the idea was to get the water from the river inside the city and to pump it through and to get it out there and there again. And so to clean it up by getting in clean water and getting out dirty water. These waterways here are still there in the city. One is the Westersingel. You may come there because it's very close to the Witte de Witstraat, where I guess you will come to have some beers or drinks. This is what it looks like now. And this is one of the richer parts, the richer Rotterdammers live here. The man that had this idea of the water project also tried to improve the areas of that were there. They were very run down. Houses were bad there. And he decided that he needed new roads there. There were no east-west roads there. And he decided that the new water that he made could be a park area with villas. And this has been built. This is one of these east-west streets that he thought of. It's called the Witte de Witstraat. And again, that's where you could eat or have a drink. Likely some of you have anyone been there yesterday? Well, not many. You'll get there, you'll get there. And this same guy thought, okay, this is Rotterdam itself, we need to grow, so he took the land areas of neighboring municipalities and made big plans for it. This was a plan for new port areas to the west of the city, which wasn't part of Rotterdam at that time, or at the south of the city. This is where the Feyenoord Stadium stands now. These plans were never carried out, but it was the basis of annexing these neighboring municipalities in Rotterdam, so Rotterdam had all freedom to make plans for it later. Oops. This is one of the examples of the plans that Rotterdam made when it was allowed to do that, when it was the boss there. This is again the west of the city. We are now here. and most of this plan has been carried out. It was taken in 3 different social groups. The green was for the very rich. That's where I live. It's a street right now, it's amazing. I don't think I belong there anymore because there are Rolls Royces, Jaguars, many Porsches, Bentleys. They're all in my street, and I think, what are they doing here? And then I think, what am I doing here? Because I don't have a car. Anyway, that was built for the rich. You can see it in several ways. One way is the houses are very big, and the other way is their gardens are very big. I have a garden of 150 square meters right in the center of town, which is really big. And that was done to lure the rich people to stay and live in Rotterdam. The blue ones are for the middle class. Their streets are wide, their gardens is not so big, and the houses are a little bit smaller. And then the red ones, they are very narrow streets, and there's hardly any space between the houses. You can see there's not much space. So if you're at the back of your house, you can read the paper at the people at the other side. It works for a long time. Here you can see, these are the low income streets. This is the middle income street, and that's the high income street. This is my street. It's really a burden living there. Then this is the west, and the same happened to the east. Something needed to be done about the south as well. There was no connection across the river. That connection came at the end of the 19th century. Bridges were built across the river, and there were railway connections to the rest of the world. First to the north of the Netherlands, but then also to Belgium. And for Belgium, they needed those bridges. And then when the bridges were there, when the railways were there, they started to develop this part as a port area. This here, let's see. You can see this is all land. Now Katendrecht is here somewhere, had disappeared. These are the bridges that they built at that time, at the end of the 19th century, to the left. They've all gone. But an artist here in town made a piece of art to remember the bridges. And there you see a model of one of the bridges, of a part of one of the bridges. And if you go to this thing, this how do you call it, a binocular? No, it's a one-ocular. And if you look through this one, you see that part of the bridge just as like it's still lying there as in the old times in the city. Hardly anyone knows that this is a piece of art and that this does exist, but you can go there and just try and see if it works for you. I like it, but maybe I like it because I know the artist, and that is because his son was at the same school as my daughter. These are part of the old times, and the buildings that were built in the early port of Rotterdam. This is called het entrepotgebouw, and this is what it looks like now. At that time it was for storage, now it's a shopping center. It was meant to be a very nice shopping center, where you go for fun shopping and nice food. And the example of that were found in America, in the United States, in Baltimore, for instance, where they redeveloped an old harbor into the inner harbor with shopping malls, etc. There it works, here it didn't work. This also inspired by America. The first skyscraper of Rotterdam. Some people in Rotterdam think it's the first one in Europe, but it's not. That's in Austria or in Edinburgh. It's very American because the height is American, but also the design is American. And the idea of modern offices in one building was American. This is the example that people think was used to build the Rotterdam skyscraper. This is a hotel. By the way, it's called the Netherlands Hotel, and it stands in New York. It doesn't exist, but you can see the similarities between the two buildings. And this is what a skyscraper looks like now. You can see that it's all very relative, what is high. At the time it was built, it was a beast in the skyline of Rotterdam because it towered twice the height of the rest. And this is what it is like now. This is the Old Port, another place where you can go to eat and drink. Then, early 20th century, urban development changed. There had to be official new plans, so informal things were no longer possible. The quality of houses should be better. There came money to make social housing, and the town got the possibility to dispossess land and property, which make it easier to carry out new plans. These are the plans that Rotterdam made once that law was there. And you can still see the small triangle in the middle, which is the medieval town, but you can see that it has enlarged enormously at the cost of other municipalities. The darker color is what had already been built. The less dark pink is plans that existed, and the yellow bits were for later already part of Rotterdam, but had not been built upon or had no plans yet. There was a difference in the kind of buildings that were built in the early 20th century. This is what was built by the end of the 19th century, and you see they're all built in 3 houses at one time. That was done by small developers trying to make big money quickly. They bought a bit of land, they built houses and sold them and hoped they would be rich from it. If they failed, they thought, if we fail, we can still go bankrupt and then go back, work for another developer. After the social housing became more money, this kind of blocks were built. They were much bigger, and you don't see individual houses anymore. They're all apartments. The Justus van Effen block is it's a very special block in that respect. This is another one. I don't know whether you'll see it. It's called the Kiefhoek. It's built by an architect called J.J.P. Oud, who was the city architect. And in the 1930s, there was a big exhibition in New York at the Museum of Modern Art there about modern architecture. And they said there were 4 really good modern architects in the world. Mies van der Rohe was one of them. Le Corbusier was one of them. And Oud was one of these 4. One of the 4 best architects in the world. This is some of the things that he built. Here you see how it was, here it is, how it is now. And this is something that Oud also made. It was built on the Koolsingel. There was a cafe called the Union. It was destroyed during the bombardment, and it was rebuilt on another street, the Westersingel, in the 1980s. But it was rebuilt according to the original plans and colors. And if you look at it, you can see this is the style, Mondrian, etc. You can recognize that in it. This is also modern architecture in the 1930s. This is the Van Nelle Fabriek, not very far from here. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site even. It's really a beautiful building, if you like it. I do. But this we built also. This is more German, expressionist in terms of style, or brick expressionist using bricks. Hamburg, also a big port. Rotterdam was inspired by Hamburg. That building is a beautiful building in Hamburg. And this is just across the water there is the tax office from the 1940s. And it's, especially if you look at this, I mean, you see that in the Hamburg Kantorhaus also. Or this, the museum that's now closed to the right. It was built inspired by Stockholm and the architecture of Stockholm. Then the war. The left picture is during the bombardment, to the right what it looked like after the bombardment. It looks like the church is still standing, but it's just walls, nothing left, nothing else. Here you can see the area that was bombed during the war. This picture was taken when it was all, let's say, cleaned up, when all the ruins were taken away, the rubble was taken away, and you had an empty area. You can see it was a huge area, and you can still, or you can see that it's the old medieval triangle that was completely destroyed. Only 2 buildings remained, maybe 3 or 4, remained from the old age, from the 17th century or earlier. And they were rebuilt and reconstructed. The rest was all gone. You can see the boundary of the bombed area with these things in the town. These are small lights in the pavement. And this is the line of the boundary of the bombed area. Those lights are all along this line. If you go to the Witte de Witstraat, you'll find it somewhere, lights like this. There's red ones, that was done by the German Air Force. The green ones was also destroyed, but that was done by friendly fire, by the Dutch army. And these are some of the many, many monuments reminding you to the war. The left one is made by someone called Zatkin. This one, these are all meant to be tears. This is kind of a full-scale replica of a city gate that was standing close to that point. And then reconstruction plan came. The first one in 1941 couldn't be carried out because the Germans forbade to build. They needed all the steel for the army, and they needed the men to build things for war and not houses. So a new plan was made in 1946, which was much more modern. And here you can see the difference. This is what was built by the end of the 19th century, and this is reconstruction after the war. This was according to ideas that if you built higher, you could make bigger parts green and still house the same number of people. The problem with this is no one owned this. It didn't really work the way they wanted to, but this is very visible, the ideas of the 20th century versus the non-ideas or the capitalism of the 19th century, was making money. Here you can also see how close the backsides of these houses are close to each other. That I didn't lie, you can read the paper with your neighbors at the other side. Those people were not rich enough to buy a paper, by the way. And this is another example of what was built, modern. For this too was inspired by the United States. People that had shops like these went to the United States to look how to do it, and then do it in Rotterdam. It's not the architectural design that is American. The architectural design is really European. You wouldn't find this in the US. But the interior, how the department store was organized, was inspired by the United States. And this is again the lijnbaan, what I told you, where they made the ropes for the shipping, this one, and the name comes back in the shopping center. This was the first shopping center only for people on foot, for pedestrians. No cars allowed. It's not completely true. The cars were all at the back of the shops. And then came urban renewal. This is more or less a symbol of urban renewal. Old houses were renovated, and to create extra space, they built up an extra floor and done that with something called trespa, which was a cheap and light material, and ugly. People hated it. They hated the modernism, the big flats and things like that, and they hated the trespa things. and something else came instead. This was a symbol of what people hated. When this one does exist, but when it had to be built, there was a lot of opposition to building it. People didn't want it because they didn't want high buildings like that. It would have cost the city millions of guilders at that time to prevent it, so it had to be built. But they promised it would be the last one. They called it the last erection of capitalism. And it was for almost 10 years. And instead of that, something came called human skill. And experiments like the cube houses, you may already have seen or you will see, that's on the other side from the market hall, or this, the old harbor. This was all built by one architect. And his philosophy was, if you walk here, you cannot see that it was built by one architect. But it was. And from 1985, rebuilding had finished, renewal had more or less finished, and there was an idea of building a new city. This is the time I came to live here, and you could find posters in the city. Amsterdam has it, Rotterdam builds it. And that was the spirit. We are going to make this town. There was a new optimism to make a new Rotterdam. There was a report called The New Rotterdam. And that is what you see now. This was the first high-rise built in that new period with the new optimism. And this is the plans that were made to the left for the Kop van Zuid in the 1980s. And you can see there was a lot of ambition at that time. And to the left, you can see, or to the right, you can see what came of it. It was meant to be for offices. But it didn't work like that because in Amsterdam it was much easier to build offices than here for many reasons, financial among them. At some time it started to shift toward building not just offices but also apartments. The city council didn't like it. And I remember the alderman saying, I don't want French fries eating students there. And now it's full of them. Not French fries eating tourists, most of it. And the city is being green. To the left you see the square in front of the old church. It was a dead space at that time, it really was, no one came there. Then they decided to make it green and immediately people came there. The difference between a green area and a stone area could be seen in terms of how it was used. In the first time it was not used, in the second it was intensively used. This is being done all over the city now. And this came. This is the last example of our new hope for a better city. And this little thing here, that was in the drawing that won the first prize this morning, is Swiss. And was made by a Swiss artist called Pipolotti Rist. And from her home in Switzerland, on the computer, she can organize what projections come from that green little bit. So it changes all the time. You have to go there in the evening, of course, to see it. And this will also be green. To the left, it used to be a railway viaduct. Railways, trains that went from Rotterdam to The Hague. And the rich people from Rotterdam wanted to live in The Hague. They were very happy with that railway line because they could live nicely in The Hague where it was nice. And they were within half an hour they were in Rotterdam where they had to work. That railway line has disappeared and the viaduct is still there. And to the right you see the plan. It has to be a green walking way or something like that. Also inspired by the US and by France. To the left is the same. It's also a viaduct for trains, the Viaduc des Arts. Beautiful. It's been there for more than 10 years, more than 20 years, and it still functions. And to the right is this one, the High Line, another railway line. The railway line, that one failed, I think. It was meant to be a green area for that neighborhood. But right now, if you go there at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, there's already queues of tourists going there to tick it off on their list what they have to see in New York. And there's hardly space for the people, for the neighborhood to enjoy that green area anymore. But it is beautiful, and it's an inspiration for what's going to happen in Rotterdam. Oh. Is this it? And that's where I stop. Thank you.